It's my pleasure to introduce Larry Love this evening. Larry and Ann are friends of ours, and we met them through antiquing. As I said, I probably wouldn't have any friends if it wasn't for antiquing, since I'm a new arrival in Calgary, relatively new. Anyway, Larry worked for an oil company in downtown Calgary for several years, and then later he worked as a stamp dealer, specializing in early Canadian stamps and postal history. Larry started collecting pressed glass because he inherited a small collection of pressed glass from his mother, and he found it interesting to search for goblets and identify the various patterns. And since that, he's become quite an avid collector of pressed glass goblets. In addition to collecting pressed glass, Larry has other collecting interests, which include Canadian stamps, postal history, Royal Dalton Bunnykins, marbles, art, and he recently has started collecting old bottles. Perfect. Go ahead.
Okay, my topic tonight is about the pressed glass tableware known as early American patterned glass, or simply patterned glass. It's the machine-made glass tableware used through much of the 1800s and early 1900s. I'll talk about the process of producing pressed glass, the evolution of patterns from the 1820s to the early 1900s, then provide some background on factory history, and finally talk about the glass I brought out. That might sound like a lot, but I should be able to cover it in about 10 minutes. As to what we mean by pressed glass, it is the glass that has been mechanically pressed in the molten state. In the early years of pressing glass, molten glass would be drawn from a furnace on a rod and dropped into a hot cast iron mold located in a press. The press operator would pull on the lever, sending a plunger into the mold. The item would be removed from the mold and taken for finishing to remove rush edges and seams. With advances in technology, the process by the early 1900s would be pretty much fully automated. The first glass pressing machines were thought to have been developed in the United States in the 1820s. This innovation started a revolution in glassmaking, enabling the production of items that were far less expensive than blown glassware. The first pressed glass tableware was known as lacy glass, as the patterns, in order to hide flaws, often had a stippled background with a lace-like pattern. And as the Boston and Sandwich Glass Company was one of the early producers of it, it's also sometimes called sandwich glass. There wasn't a large variety of items, and as far as I know, there were no goblets made. By the 1840s, with improvements in pressing equipment, there was a period for several years when patterns became more plain and geometric in shape. Until the 1860s, the glass contained lead, providing the glass with clarity and a ringing tone when tapped. Then in 1864, a new glass formula was discovered in which soda lime replaced the use of lead. This development resulted in significant cost savings, and by the 1870s, the use of lead in making patterned glass had been phased out. The 1870s and 1880s saw the popularity of patterned glass grow enormously, with hundreds of new patterns being introduced, with extensive sets of tableware often available in several dozen different forms. By this time, most households would have some patterned glass. In addition to geometric shapes, patterns included a number of subjects, including fruit, berries, flowers, birds, and animals. This period also saw the introduction of colored glass, with a variety of colors, including amber, blue, green, Vaseline, and ruby. Original colored pieces are hard to come by, and most of what you see are reproductions. It is estimated that there are over 3,000 patterns, with about 1,700 of these known in goblet form. By the 1890s, patterned glass that imitated cut glass became very popular and is known as pressed cut. The cut glass of this era was of exceptional quality. For most, it was an unaffordable luxury. Although not having the presence of cut glass, the pressed glass was far more affordable. And these goblets in the 1890s would sell for about 5 cents a piece, whereas a cut glass goblet would cost about $1. So, big difference. And like maybe a butter dish would be 15 or 20 cents. A cut glass one could be $3 or $4. So most people just couldn't afford it. And I think, it seems to me in the 1890s, it cost about 3 cents to mail a letter. So, by the early 1920s, patterned glass had lost its popularity as affordable crystal was being imported from Europe, and what is known as depression glass became available. I just wanted to mention a few things about the history of pressed glass factories. In addition to patterned glass, many of these factories also produced other pressed glass items, including lamps, bottles, and insulators, just to name a few, and also had glass blowing operations. The industry had a history of fires, labor strikes, mergers, and factory closures. And in the United States, the 1880s saw a big increase in the number of factories, which peaked at around 75 in the late 1880s, with many of these located in Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania, with Pittsburgh being the largest center of glassmaking. By the early 1890s, overproduction, labor problems, declining quality, and the depression of the 1890s resulted in many plant closures. And in an attempt to improve profits and stabilize the industry, 2 large combines were formed. And in 1891, 18 of the largest companies amalgamated to form the United States Glass Company. Well, many of their factories were to close. They continued in business till the 1960s. Then in 1899, 19 companies joined to form the National Glass Company, and labor problems played a major role in their demise, and in 1907 they declared bankruptcy. And it was kind of interesting history, because I can't imagine how you amalgamate 18 companies. And I don't think these days the government would even allow it. Although in Canada we had a number of glass-making factories, there aren't that many that are known for sure to have produced patterned glass. In Ontario, there was the Burlington Glass Works, which began making patterned glass in the mid-1880s, and in Toronto, the Jefferson Glass Company opened a factory in 1913. In Quebec, there was the St. Lawrence Glass Company in Montreal, which is known from ads to have made a variety of tableware items in the late 1860s. Also in Quebec, the St. John's Glass Company, which became the Excelsior Glass Company, is known to have made patterned glass by 1880. In Trenton, Nova Scotia, there were 3 factories operating in the 1880s and 1890s, and items from these factories are often of special interest to Canadian collectors, as the patterns are believed to be uniquely Canadian. Many of the Canadian comes ultimately became part of the Dominion Glassworks. And many of the patterns were only made in the States, but many more were also known to be made in both Canada and the States. And because the glass typically isn't marked, it's, aside from perhaps the Nova Scotia ones, we don't know for sure where they are, but most of them have probably been made in the States. Patterned glass was also made in Europe, but comment on their factory history is beyond the scope of my talk tonight. In the final part of my talk, I want to mention some of the characteristics of patterned glass and talk about what I've brought out. As mentioned earlier, there are over 3,000 patterns, with some 1,700 known in goblet form. Often patterns will have more than one name, and some of the US companies identified their patterns by number. The goblets were originally intended for use as water goblets, but today they can also be used as a wine glass. And the smaller glasses I brought out, they were the wine glasses of that era, as wine was very expensive. And it would be interesting to know what a bottle of wine cost in the 1890s, but it must have been very expensive. And I think most of it was probably imported, because I don't think our Canadian wine was that great in those days. One of the characteristics of pressed glass would be the presence of mold seams, there being 2, 3, or 4 of them. Often they've been removed from the upper portion of the item with fire polishing, but the seams will still be visible at the base. And also the presence of straw marks and bubbles in the glass is quite common. All these goblets will have seam marks on them. Now I've placed the goblets in a sequence starting at your left with a couple of early ones. And these two furthest ones would be 1850s or 1860s vintage. And they have a lead content, and if you give them a tap, they have a ringing tone, just as if any of you have cut glass or crystal. If you do that, it'll have a ringing tone because of the lead content. The next group, starting from here, see, going over to about here, would be from the 1870s and 1880s, after they stopped using lead in the glass. And they illustrate the variety of shapes and themes available, and as you can see, there's quite a variety. And then 7 of these glasses here are Nova Scotia patterns. And the next group, this group in here, would be from the 1890s and early 1900s, when they're attempting to imitate the cut glass of the period. So although they don't have the brilliance of cut glass, as mentioned earlier, they were a fraction of the cost. In this group, I've got one here that's turned quite purple, and this is a result of the manganese in the glass reacting to the ultraviolet rays of either sunlight or an ultraviolet light. And although the use of manganese was discontinued around 1915, I've seen some modern day glass with a purplish color, so I don't know, maybe somebody putting the manganese back in again to give it that color. And the last few goblets are, these 3 here are reproductions, or copies of original patterns made from new molds. And there's about 200 patterns that are known to have been reproduced in certain forms. And these are often the goblets or other usable items, and things that I think people think they can sell. And some museums have reproduced patterns for their own collections. And most of the reproductions are well documented, with some of them being marked. However, many are not marked, so identifying them may require some research. And I've just brought out a few other pressed glass items, and this last group is just a few items that were used in the pressed glass era, but were commonly, you wouldn't see commonly used as tableware today. And this is a spooner, and this was part of your basic tableware set, which would be the cream and sugar and the butter dish. And this one here is a celery vase, and I guess celery was quite popular in those days. I guess today you could use it as a flower vase or maybe something else. And then this is just a footed tumbler, which could be a drinking glass too. And then this goblet here, this is known as a buttermilk goblet. And some people think that they're sugar bowls with the lids missing, and that may well be, but it could still be used as a glass to be drinking something out of today. And I don't know, maybe somebody here knows something about them. And this compote is actually an English pressed glass item, which is quite interesting because it's marked with a diamond-shaped registration mark, providing information on when the design was registered at the patent office. And it's actually the only pressed glass piece I have that's marked. None of the rest of these are marked at all, because the companies just didn't do that typically. And then you might wonder why I brought out a green opalescent bowl. Well, I happen to collect them, and it is also a pressed glass piece, and it would be from around 1910, and was made by the Jefferson Glass Company. And so I think quite a bit of the opalescent glass would be pressed glass, and then Carnival glass is also pressed glass too. And of course, then there's the depression glass is pressed glass. And so that's pretty much my talk, but in conclusion, I'd just like to say that collecting the goblets has provided a lot of enjoyment over the years, and finding them and identifying the patterns. And although Anne and I occasionally find few in Calgary, they're more frequently found in antique shops in Eastern Canada and in the States. And I don't know, that may be just because that's where most of the people were in the 1800s. there weren't too many people in Calgary then. So, yeah, that's the end of my talk, and thank you very much. Was like surprising finds as to.
You would be surprised that it would have turned
Did you
out.
find any surprises around town?
No, not really. No, you know, I've you know, over the years, I've probably bought a couple where that I think a few of the Nova Scotia ones I got here, and maybe that's surprising to see them, but you know, I think over the years things move across the country, and yeah, nothing too surprising.
Yep.
The reproductions, can you tell just by looking at them? Or like, do they still have the same mold marks?
Yeah, well, the reproductions would be made from new molds. Now, the other thing that could have gone on too is there could be reissues where original molds may have been taken off the shelf and used many years later. But it just depends, like this one is an easy one because the original only was produced in clear glass. So that's pretty much a giveaway. And then, and this one, this is a pattern that was produced a few times over the years. And it's, I think this reproduction was about 1940. And then I know it was reproduced again, I think, in the 60s. And there are characteristics about it which tell you that it isn't an original. And I think this one, it's not really, it's pretty rough, and you can see the seam marks right up to the top, so I don't think it was very well made, and I think the original is probably of much better quality. And I've got a book here on identifying reproductions, so that helps too. Any other questions?
Anybody else?
So Larry, was the best goblet the first one that came off the mold?
Well, that could well be, because I think this was one of the problems they got into in the 1890s, is with the Depression and all the problems that companies were having. They were using older molds, or they just continued to use molds, and they would wear, and you'd have a poor quality item.
Yes, because I collect a lot of Depression glass, and the best pieces are the ones that came off the mold first.
Yeah, I'd expect that to be the case, yeah.
And once the mold is wearing badly, the pattern is distorted. You know?
Yeah, uh-huh.
Factors are in declining to say whether that one's Canadian or that one's American. So when Gerald Stevens was doing the dig at the Burlington Glass Works, was by far the largest glass works, producing a lot of these pressed glass, they suddenly came across this ledger, and it said, received from 3 glass companies in the States, cullet. And cullet is the solid glass. And what cullet is when one of these goblets didn't turn out, they throw it into the cullet bin. So suddenly you have these 2 big gondola cars filled up with broken glass from the American glass factories. So then when they were digging around the Burlington glass, they pick up this piece and they say, oh, they must have made this pattern. And yet nobody knows whether that was a pattern that they made or a pattern that came in as the cullet to start the new melt. So, and the other factor was that when a glassmaker was fired, he'd steal as many molds as he could and go to the competitor. So you have this sort of molds coming back and forth over the Canadian border to the American. So it, and I agree wholeheartedly with what Larry said, that the Nova Scotia patterns are perhaps the only patterns that have ever been claimed by an American glass company. The last thing I'd like to mention, and This is the honeycomb pattern, which was the highest. This was produced by every glass company in the US and in Canada. Well, just about every glass company. Called the honeycomb. This was 10 cents cheaper than all the others because it was so simple. And because it was so simple, it only had a 2-part mold. So it was just one hinge on it instead of 3 or 4 hinges on it. So this honeycomb pattern is the, as I say, was made by absolutely everybody and is the most common pattern that you see today. And as Larry so aptly mentioned, this is a water goblet, this was a wine goblet, but hey, we're in 2016. This is wine, this is for liqueur. Thanks again, Larry.
I agree, yeah. And one of the things that
Anybody
true
else?
about the Nova Scotia patterns is apparently there was a mold making facility there
Yeah.
at the Nova Scotia plant, so
Right.
that may have had something to do with why these patterns
Yeah,
were
it's,
uniquely Canadian.
Can I ask you another?
I guess it would. Are they like have patterns on them?
Yeah, they're all different.
Oh,
They're
I
all
see.
from,
Okay, yeah,
they'd
yeah.
be all made by the same glass companies, I think.
Oh, okay.
Probably not
Yeah.
as old as
Yeah,
many of these goblets,
Yeah.
but
Well, I think what things are worth, it always comes back
I'm
to.
sure they were made around the turn of the century. But I
Okay, yeah.
have quite a collection,
Okay,
and
yeah.
they're all different patterns, and I'm sure that
Right,
they
yeah.
came from the various Canadian glass
Oh,
companies.
yeah.
Maybe some of them American as well.
Oh, sure, because like, I guess the book I brought out there on the encyclopedia, there, if you look through that, you'll see just a range of items that the companies made. And, yeah, tumblers were one of them, and this one's a footed tumbler. I mean, there was, some of the patterns, I think there can be up to 100 different forms, and so
Yeah,
certainly.
I think quite a
tumblers-
few of my tumblers were made by Jefferson.
Oh, okay, yeah. Mhm. Yeah.
So Larry, if you could just point out the mark on this and where it's located.
Okay, the mark is right there, the end of my finger, and it's a registration mark indicating the day, month, and the year that the pattern was registered at the patent office in England.
Do you know why they would put it on the top rather than on the bottom?
No, I don't.
Okay, I'm just curious. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Appreciate that, Larry.